Hi there, this is Niki Gratrix. Welcome to this webinar on adverse childhood events and chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm Niki Gratrix. Some of my background is that I co-founded the Optimum Health Clinic in 2005, which is one of the largest mind-body clinics working with chronic fatigue syndrome today. And in today's webinar, I want to kind of give you an overview and the big picture. What are adverse childhood events? What is the prevalence? What's the role of ACEs, as we call them, these adverse childhood events in CFS? What's the mechanism? How does early life stress translate to biology and CFS in adulthood? And what are the steps to reversing the impact of ACEs? Now, I'm aware that I have some colleagues, Dr. Sarah Myhill, my ex-business partner, Alex Howard from the Optimum Health Clinic, and also a good friend of mine and acquaintance, Ari Witten, is also part of this CFS series for BANT. So I wanted to give the big overview and show you how everything fits together, which I guess is more of my specialist area. So here's the big overview, and that's the order we're going to go in. So let's just start with a quick definition of adverse childhood events. If you're not aware about the data of adverse childhood stress and so on, you're kind of missing out. So it's some of the most important research and the most neglected research that's been done. And yet it's Kaiser Permanente and the CDC here in the US who did these enormous studies, starting with over 17,500 adults in 1998. And they were looking at the correlation of early life stress and adult onset chronic complex illnesses. And what were they looking at? What did they define as an adverse childhood event? Well, they had 10 categories. And this was, we're talking about parents separating or divorce, physical, sexual or emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, domestic violence, mental illness in the family, substance abuse, and incarceration by a family member. So any of those 10 items. And that's the actual study. If you want to look it up, it started with about 9,500 people and then actually expanded it, and the full results are on the CDC website. So this is essentially what they found. The impact of exposure to ACEs is that, first of all, 67% of everybody in that 17,500 person study said they'd been exposed to at least one ACE. Now, already that's mind-blowing when you consider, for example, that there was so much focus on gluten sensitivity, and it's probably only 20% maximum of adults who have any kind of sensitivity, whereas a whopping 67% have had at least one, and of that group 80% have had more than one. You have a dramatic increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death if you have a high exposure to ACEs. You have a 6-fold increased risk of illnesses like chronic fatigue with ACEs. It's really the poster child illness. That's how I talk about it. And it's really how I got into the work of ACEs, working with chronic fatigue, because it's so much a study of long-term stress. People with 6 ACEs have a 20-year reduction in lifespan compared to people with 0 ACEs, according to that large study. So this is profound and important work. If you had just 4 ACEs, your relative risk of things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder is 2.5 times higher than versus people with 0 ACEs. Hepatitis risk is 2.5 times higher. Depression 4.5 times higher. Cancer 2.5. Diabetes is 1.6. Stroke 2.6. Being suicidal 12 times higher. So if you had 8 ACEs, you have a triple the risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of heart disease, which are the top 2 killers in the West, just to give you some context. So when you're working with chronic fatigue people, they're often wary about talking about psychology and that might be having an impact on them or had an impact because they've been badly treated and been classified as making their illness up and that it was all in their head. So I often educate CFS patients through blogs, podcasts, summits, letting them know that they are far from alone and that this is an epidemic across all chronic complex illness, and we're not saying that they're making it up in their minds. It's one of the reasons I give people context and give you as a practitioner context. They followed up in 2009 the same. It was Dr. Felitti, Dr. Ander from the CDC, a huge study. This was about 17,000 people again looking at ACEs and autoimmunity. And essentially, if you had 2 ACEs, you have a 70% increased risk of the Th1 dominant conditions. Th2 dominant conditions, you have an 80% increased risk with just 2 ACEs. And, the correlation of autoimmunity risk in women with ACEs is as strongly linked as smoking and lung cancer, which is, autoimmunity is a female dominant illness, which is very 80% more likely to have ACEs if you are a woman. So that's also very interesting data to consider. Just a few other pointers on ACEs. If you have four ACEs, at least four ACEs, you have 4.22 increased risk of Alzheimer's. This is according to 1,000 adults in California by the California Department of Public Health. So it's huge and it affects everything. Here's an obesity study, over 112,000 people, moderate level of abuse, you're 34% increased risk of obesity in adulthood. Severe abuse, you've got a 50% increased risk of obesity in adulthood. So let's dig into a little bit more about ACEs and CFS specifically. This first study really just looking directly at chronic fatigue and early life stress was done in 2006, where they started out with just 46 cases and controlled with 60 non-fatigue controls. And at that stage, it's quite a small study, but published in a mainstream PubMed journal here, 3 to 8-fold increased risk of CFS across different types of trauma that was experienced in childhood. So that was a significant finding. So it was basically, they repeated the study, same journal, same group size, they had this time 113 people, and with a controls group of 124, and they concluded that exposure to childhood trauma was associated with a 6-fold increased risk of CFS. You also do see this with fibromyalgia, dramatic increased risk. I think my friend Dr. David Brady these days says, you know, if you don't have emotional trauma in childhood, you don't have fibromyalgia. Actually, it was an exclusion marker for fibromyalgia. So a history of sexual or physical abuse was reported by 54% of the sample. Any type of abuse was significantly more prevalent in patients with fibromyalgia, 62%, compared with those with rheumatoid arthritis that was also in the group, which is 34%. So, you know, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, massive increased numbers of people who've actually had trauma, and it's an inherent part of their illness that you can't ignore, but from any level, from physically, energetically or emotionally, in terms of how you're going to intervene to help people. I have to say 67% prevalence of ACEs is a total underestimate. It's likely to be much higher than that. The researchers didn't know what they were doing when they first started the study. They didn't expect those results and they missed lots of ACEs. They just had those 10 categories. They ignored the fact that trauma is intergenerationally inherited, and also like prenatal stress is a gigantic factor as well. And they also ignored the prevalence of what you could call silent ACEs, emotional neglect and abuse, because it's really hard to self-report. And the ACEs questionnaire is very superficial in that context. So these are some of the examples of missed ACEs, because I always have people emailing me saying, you said this ACE, does mine, do I have, you know, does bullying count, does racism count, does being a victim of homophobia count? And I always say yes, absolutely. So physical trauma requiring hospitalisation, witnessing violence, death of a caregiver, you know, traumatic birth is a huge one, birth trauma. You know, a family in a financial crisis, one of the most traumatic things that parents can kind of go through, and that can get passed on and to the child. Homelessness, you know, and of course natural disasters. So that we could go on, and what traumatises one person won't necessarily traumatise another. So it's also very subjective. So you're looking for the signs and symptoms and so on, as well as an overall kind of list of possibilities. This is just proof that third generation survivors of the Holocaust victims have the same physiological and psychological expression as their grandparents who were in the Holocaust. This has been controversial, but it really shouldn't be anymore. There's the mainstream PubMed studies, you know, coming out really confirming this now. This was a study in 2009. Early maltreatment produced persisting changes in the methylation of BDNF, a DNA that caused altered, you know, brain-derived neurotrophic factor gene expression in the adult prefrontal cortex. So here we had this, you know, basically it changes. So these changes were in a traumatized mother, and the babies, the pups, the offspring also had the same changes. But, as you know, a traumatised mother is a worse parent, and maybe she traumatised the baby mouse, the pups, by bad behaviour. Maybe the mechanism isn't epigenetic. So they ruled out in this study, where they actually they took mice that were traumatised, male mice. The microRNA expression of the sperm of the male mice was different. That was the impact of the trauma. And then they took that, I call it traumatised sperm, and they injected it in healthy, non-traumatised eggs of healthy female mice and the offspring had the same, alterations resulting in the progeny. So that ruled out bad behaviour, bad behavioural parenting. So, and there it is, this is Nature, world-class journal. So it really is passed down intergenerationally. It's through the male line and the female line. Just a quick study, maternal stress, depression, anxiety definitely affects fetal neurobehavioral development. The studies are in here. We just see these studies are in line with the growing body of literature supporting the fetal origins hypothesis that prenatal environmental exposures, including maternal psychologic state-based alterations in utero physiology, have sustained effect across the lifespan of the baby. So, trauma is, if mum's traumatised, she'll pass it on to her baby in utero as well. The final point about why we have an underestimate of 67% from that original ACEs study is this idea of silent ACEs. And this is really important to understand because, like, if you're a nutritionist and you ask somebody, how's your diet? They could just answer back. It's a very superficial question. They can answer back, yeah, it's fine. And then you'll look at the diet as a professional and go, there's quite a lot of changes to be made here. It's the same. If you just ask somebody, were you emotionally neglected or do you experience emotional abuse as a child? The likelihood is they'll have no clue and just come back to you and say, yeah, it was, my childhood was great. So that's what happens with superficial questions. And Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is the world leading expert in trauma at the moment. He's the head of psychiatry at Boston Medical School. And he's actually saying that he's the one who actually said the ACEs study is too superficial to pick up where most trauma is coming from in childhood. And this is a key takeaway. He even did studies working with the National Centre for the Child Traumatic Stress Network. He reports that he ran a survey of 40,000 children nationally being treated for multiple traumas here in the US. And he said that most of them do not meet the criteria for PTSD, as the majority of issues are not specific traumas, but issues in their attachment relationships. And this is critical. So of that list of the different types of traumas, bullying and all the rest of it, the most prevalent is very early attachment trauma. We'll talk about what that is, which leads on to developmental trauma. And anything that is up to age 18 also contributes to this kind of idea of developmental trauma. Attachment trauma occurs in the first 1,000 days from conception to age 2. It's the time before the thinking brain comes online, before the frontal cortex develops. It doesn't quite qualify as a PTSD diagnosis because it's often not a discrete event, though it could be. It's to do with the primary caregivers, and there's not a discrete single incident. It's more relational trauma or ambient trauma, and that can carry on past stage 4 as well. Just to compare here, PTSD is the reaction to a single event. You then get triggered by things that remind you of that event. You can have flashbacks and nightmares. There is avoidance of situations that will remind you of that traumatic event that happened. You'll feel keyed up, jittery, you'll get hypervigilant, you can have sleep problems. So that's PTSD to a single event. Usually it could be more than one event, but those are the type of reactions. Developmental trauma, as I mentioned, is ambient. It's not a single trauma. And, when there isn't improper emotional bonding with the primary caregivers, it leads the child to have difficulty regulating their emotions. They have an inability to self-soothe. They come up with self-destructive behaviour patterns. They can have chronic anger, anxiety or depression. They can have self-love deficit disorder, which is coarse, shame, self-loathing, potent inner critic. They can end up with ADHD, concentration difficulties in relationships and getting relationships in adulthood as well. These are your fibromyalgia people. These are your chronic fatigue syndrome people. That, it's not to say they won't have PTSD as well, necessarily, but a lot of it is this type of developmental trauma. We'll talk more about it, what that means later. But just to back this up, the strange situation studies were done 1970 to 99. Over 6,000 parent infants were observed. And essentially, you would put the mother and baby with a stranger in a room. Mum would leave the room for a few minutes, and then she would come back, and this was observed. And only in that 6,000 mother-baby interaction, strange situation studies, only 55% of babies have secure attachment. That's the block-busting figure. 23% are avoidance. That's a sad case where essentially the mother is, even if she's physically looking after the baby, she can be rejecting of it because she's not emotionally expressing love for the baby, and she may even be rejecting it. And avoidance, unfortunately, mum goes out of the room, baby doesn't react. Mum comes back in the room, baby doesn't react. And it's already, the baby has kind of shut down and has already learned to devalue its own emotional state, and that's what it's going to do in adulthood as well. 22% ambivalent disorganised. This is more to do with, this is where mum leaves the room, baby becomes very upset. Mum comes back in the room, baby's still very upset and just doesn't calm down, has a real difficulty calming down. And this is also, you're going to see this kind of thing in adulthood, kind of very needy people that, you know the type we're talking about, kind of very insecure in relationships and kind of can be what we call end up codependent. As of 2017, it's probably only 50% of adults were able to create secure, happy, loving, long-term relationships based on the early results of the strange situation studies. Amazingly, this was replicated. How we attach as babies affects our relationships throughout life. Over 10,000 adult attachment interviews were completed over 25 years up to 2009. They replicated the same results. You know, they call it 23% dismissing, only 58% were securely attached. So this adult attachment interview is you know, what you can do. You can assess for attachment trauma with this adult attachment interview. Now, it takes 75 minutes to complete by the person doing it. It takes 10 hours to transcribe and 4 hours to assess by professionals. It's amazingly 85% accurate in predicting how an adult will attach with their own child. But clearly just consider that the ACEs questionnaire is clearly too superficial on its own when that's what it takes to assess for attachment trauma. So just, you know, bear that in mind. I'm going to give you some other tools to, you know, basically if somebody's showing up with chronic fatigue syndrome and they've got some developmental trauma, you'll be able to see that, and they probably had attachment trauma. And there's ways that, you know, don't just rely on the ACEs questionnaire. We'll come back to that later. I think the point I'm trying to take away for you, or what the point I'd like you to take away, is that, you know, trauma can occur simply when emotional bonding and love is withheld. A lack of care and empathy is all that's needed to traumatize a young baby. Young babies need love for growth, and so do adults, and not just growth, but for health. You know, the baby's brain and its health develops in social context, and this loving expression, you know, love is medicine, love is food. So this is the real point I'm trying to get to you here. But also, you know, nothing physical has to happen to create trauma. Neglect is not about what happened, but what didn't happen. And by the way, just really interesting, when you hear about these very bad psychopaths who kind of kill people, like serial killers, and there's always this mystery, but the person seemed to have a normal childhood, and it was, you know, their physical needs were looked after, and they can't really see anything that happened. And then actually when you dig in, and not many people know how to assess for an emotional neglect, you actually find there's some very imbalanced things that happened, and a lack of love, even though somebody was physically perfectly well looked after. And so just bear that in mind for your own, you know, selves as well. If you've been struggling with, say, certain, you know, issues psychologically, and you can't seem to see anything in your own childhood, you know, might want to dig in a little further. So how does this childhood biography become adult biology? The big question. Well, really, we need to get into and dig into the biochemistry of stress. So what's very important here, there were some landmark studies done, and you'll just see they totally overlap with what we see in chronic fatigue. So in 2004, there's a landmark study done by Michael Meany, a neuroscientist, and Mo Schiff, who was a geneticist. While working at McGill University in Montreal 2004, they discovered the type and amount of nurturing a mother rat provides in the early weeks of the rat's infancy determines how that rat responds to stress in later life. Nurturing behaviours from the mother rat were found to stimulate activation of stress signalling pathways and remove methyl groups from DNA in the glucocorticoid receptor gene. This releases a tightly wound gene, exposing it for transcription. The glucocorticoid gene is activated, resulting in lowered stress response. So, you know, when you get love and stroking and care and attention, the stress response reduces. Rat pups that receive a less nurturing upbringing are more sensitive to stress throughout their lifespan. Now, this is really important, and it's one of the reasons why I put so much emphasis on early life stress, because a lot of people say to me, well, what about adult stress? I mean, what about adult trauma? And I say, yes, that's all really important. But what you'll see in adults, you know, everybody knows that stress kills. You know, there's so much studies showing the downside of stress, and that's in adulthood. You know, too many phone calls, too many emails, running around stressed. By the way, if you're leading that kind of lifestyle, the research in PET scans shows that you have the equivalent of one ACE. That's if you're just stressed, you know, I don't know, you're doing got tons of clients, you're doing a PhD, your life is too busy, well, you're already creating stress. The issue they always talk about in these adult stress studies is they always say it's subjective stress, it's perceived stress. So, because what they found with adults is you can have a stressful event happen. One adult has a real high level of stress response and the other one has exactly the same stressor and doesn't perceive the event in the same way. So what they're saying is it's not the event, it's the perceived subjective stress. Well, what sets this perceived subjective stress in somebody? Your early life experience. So that's the importance of these studies. These studies are showing that a neuroendocrine immune reset occurs from the date the trauma happened in early childhood. You're going to have an increased stress response, going to feel less stress, and you're going to have less resilience to inevitable adult stresses that happen to you, you know, in adulthood. So this is the key thing to take away from this as well. And this is often missed, by the way, in sort of the American Academy of Stress and so on. They talk about in a kind of superficial way without looking at the root cause, which is actually what happened in childhood. That's what affects your subjective perception. And there are even what are called mirror neurons that the brain of the child develops in a social context, and it is affected by others. It's called self and other, and there are mirror neurons. You don't get empathy in childhood, you don't develop empathy neurons. So that's just one example. The studies they did with rats were replicated in humans. Here we go in 2009. Same researchers. And then other researchers also started to look. There's obviously a lot of research started to get done because the ACEs studies were so big and important. And here they said, you know, a critical brake is switched off. A child is marinating in stress hormones and inflammatory cytokines from a young age, and they have a lowered threshold response to stressors. But it wasn't just the glucocorticoid receptors and that stress response. You know, Dr. Joan Kaufman, Yale Medical Schools, came out and said, well, actually, child maltreatment is associated with widespread differences in methylation across the entire genome, including biological processes relevant in psychiatric and substance use disorders, heart disease, stroke, respiratory disease, diabetes, and cancer. So from the date the trauma happened, you know, the body keeps the score. That's the name of Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. If it's before the age of 4, you may not even have memory or articulate you had trauma, but your body remembers, and it's marinating in, you know, that autoimmune trigger that when you were 30 that triggered off actually started, could have been before the age 4. And we know early life stress here, they've replicated maternal separation disrupts the integrity of the intestinal microflora in rhesus monkeys. Early life stress alters behavior, immunity, microbiota in rats. Implications for irritable bowel syndrome, psychiatric illnesses. You know, prenatal stress alters bacterial colonizations of the gut in infant monkeys. Nutritional approach to restore impaired intestinal barrier function and growth after neonatal stress in rats. So kind of huge connection between, you know, this gut-brain axis. It's bidirectional. It's not just the gut affecting the brain. You know, a lot of where gut problems, when you see an adult or a teenager coming to see you with gut dysbiosis, a huge reason it's there in the first place is emotional trauma early on. And that has now, unfortunately, as we know, once you have dysbiosis, that's a vicious cycle, because now that creates more depression and anxiety because the state of the gut is affecting the brain. So it's a vicious cycle. How might emotional stress affect somebody? It really depends on the mixture of the type of stress you had and what your genetic propensity is. I think there's some energetic impact on this as well. You know, it's very interesting how certain psychologies seem to express in certain physical illnesses that seem to link with the psychology they have. But, you know, some people will go on to have early life trauma, and their genes means that they'll have mental disorders, bipolar, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. By the way, just out of huge interest, Bessel van der Kolk essentially says this manual of diagnostic and statistical manual for the American Society of Psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness, he says most of that would disappear if you actually realise that most mental diseases are an adaptation to ACEs in childhood. They are literally, they came about because of what happened in childhood, and again they're fighting to get this recognised. Developmental trauma is currently not recognised by the American Psychiatric Society, and as Bessel van der Kolk said, they seem to be more interested in studying genes than dealing with social realities. That's a direct quote. Anyway, so someone else, you know, they might get the gut dysbiosis and they end up going down an autoimmune route. Other people, it's going to more directly affect, say, mitochondrial function and their redox balance. That's the chronic fatigue syndrome group. So, you know, chronic fatigue really is a study of the long-term impact of stress. It's like an expanded process of stress. It fits completely in this kind of functional medicine model. I think most likely, you see, most emotional trauma and stress will lead on to a diagnosable, in a conventional context, will lead on to a diagnosable disease state. Chronic fatigue missed that there still isn't a biological marker for chronic fatigue syndrome, but we're probably the closest right now for creating a biological marker by looking at the impact of long-term stress on mitochondrial function. So that's very interesting. This is, you know, the standard model that most people know, you know, understand some of the basics about the impact of stress. We have the standard model that we understand is that this stress is picked up first by the amygdala. I would say, by the way, that your heart rate variability in the field around the heart actually picks up the trauma in the environment first, a split second. There are more afferent nerves going up from the heart to the brain than vice versa. So your heart picks up there's a problem, tells the amygdala picks that up and triggers this sympathetic nervous system response and this hypothalamic response that is going to speak to the adrenals via the pituitary, via the glucocorticoids. Sympathetic nervous system is going to, you know, trigger off epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, and this over time is going to lead to all the changes that we see: inflammation, redox imbalances, increased free radical stress, less sleep, you know, toxin buildup, you know, imbalance in digestion. You know, the impact. If you look at the impact of stress on a functional level, these are all the things. That could be a picture of chronic fatigue right there. It's everything you see that changes in chronic fatigue syndrome. If you're in a chronic state of fight, flight, you're going to have lower digestive enzymes, you're going to have gut dysbiosis, you've probably got intestinal permeability. You're going to end up with neurotransmitter imbalances such as lowered serotonin and dopamine. That links with, by the way, hormone, could be female hormone imbalances, sex hormone imbalances, you know, progesterone out of balance, estrogen out of balance that are connected with the neurotransmitters. We talked about this HPA axis dysfunction that can lead on to thyroid and sex hormone imbalances. Leaky blood-brain barrier and excessive microglial activity. You see brain inflammation and chronic fatigue. We'll talk about that in a second. You know, we'll be peeing out all our magnesium if we're chronically stressed and the other classic nutrient deficiencies which we're not absorbing as well because of lowered, you know, digestive enzymes. Mitochondrial dysfunction, we need to talk, I'll briefly talk about the cell danger response, which is really the cutting edge of research looking at mitochondrial dysfunction. The skewed immune system, so we now get allergies and reactions to things, and yet we have lowered defense against microbes, classic Th1, Th2 skew. And increased internal toxicity. So, you know, that's all fights, being stuck in fight, flight, which is, you know, the opposite of the parasympathetic rest, digest, detoxify, switched off. This is a really important paper. If you're interested in chronic fatigue, you need to get this paper. It's free online, you can download the whole thing. It really sums up everything that we just talked about as how that applies to chronic fatigue. And it's been written by DePaul University Group. It's Dr. Leonard Jason, who's the world leading expert in the case definition of chronic fatigue syndrome. He's an amazing psychologist, actually. He's a professor of psychology, but here he is getting really into psychoneuroimmunology. And this is a really great paper that really shows how from early life, or even he wasn't mentioning it in early life, but in the context of what's happening in adulthood with people with chronic fatigue, is that they are neurologically wired for this fight-flight response. They have literally neurons wired for fight-flight. And then you see all the cascading changes in the body that happen as a result of that. And, you know, it's when we get a build-up of dendrites and neurons in response to a stressor, this is really how the brain learns anything. So it's particularly at the young human brain, an early baby, you know, sized brain is very responsive to this learning thing. So we need a chronic stimulant will cause this building of neurons, neurons that fire together, wire together. And this is like, it's, Nobel Prize winning work. Repeated electrical stimulation sensitized nerves in these animals he was looking at, causing them to learn to react to less stimuli. This was Eric Kandel, who was observing how the brain learns things. And so you need this repeated electrical stimulation that builds neural pathways. So how does that apply to what Dr. Leonard Jason is calling kindling theory as it applies to chronic fatigue? According to kindling theory, repeated exposure to initially sub-threshold stimulus can eventually exceed threshold limits, resulting in persistent hypersensitivity to the stimulus and ultimately spontaneous behavioural manifestations. Kindling was first discovered by Goddard in 1967 while studying the effect of electrical stimulation of the amygdaloid complex in learning. Initially, he electrically stimulated the brains of rats at very low intensity, which was below the threshold for eliciting seizure activity. When the stimulation was applied over a period of weeks, the rats experienced epileptic convulsions. In other words, after repeated exposure to small electrical shocks, the rats began to have spontaneous seizure-like events. Goddard and others also found it was possible to induce kindling via chemical stimulation. Gellhorn postulated that over prolonged stimulation of the limbic hypothalamic pituitary axis, a lowered threshold for activation can occur. Once the system is charged either by high-intensity stimulation due to a viral infection or by chronically repeated low-intensity stimulation through repeated chemical exposure, it can sustain a high level of arousal with little or no stimulus. Well, this is exactly what the rat pups were getting when they got that gentle nurturing response from mum. When she doesn't get that, when the babies don't get that, they can be prone to kindling, and then they're more reactive to stress. These three researchers, this is straight from this study, this paper, suggest that the excessive arousal can lead to an increase in the dendrites of the limbic system, which can further increase limbic stimulation. In other words, we're hardwired for stress. We're saying there are neural pathways for an increased stress response, and that's what we're probably seeing in many chronic fatigue syndrome patients. And there are genetic propensities that are showing up that might mean there's an increased response to that too. I could have talked about so much that's so interesting in that area, and I won't have time today, but look up orchid dandelion theory, and it's to do with certain people having genes that makes them more delicate and have a higher stress response. So that does play into this as well. So what does the paper say is the result of kindling? And you can imagine kindling is this like overexcited state of the brain wired for the sympathetic nervous system response. Well, they linked it to this idea that we see glandular depletion, changes, that's the smaller adrenal size, HPA axis, lowered cortisol output, the Th1, Th2 imbalance we see, disruption in the ion transport channel, how things are going in and outside the cell, reduction of grey matter in the brain and lesions. This is all things we see that's been validated in papers in chronic fatigue syndrome. Reduction of GABA, the calming neurotransmitters, changes in acetylcholine, increased MNDA, which is excitatory neurotransmitter, reduction of antioxidants, and all that leads to what? Cardiomyopathy. Well, that's all linked to mitochondrial dysfunction and increased oxidative stress levels, which is really where a lot of the research in chronic fatigue is now focusing. So the body doesn't differentiate between social, emotional, chemical, electrical or microbial stress, but I would like to offer to you that emotional stress is probably the number one cause. Right initially from childhood, it's usually the trigger which leads to a viral infection. When we have chronic stress, it's well understood in psychoneuroimmunology that it will suppress the immune system. Most people say, well, I got chronic fatigue syndrome after I got a respiratory infection. Ask them what was going on 3 months before that. It's usually an emotional stress which caused suppression of the immune system, and a virus was allowed to proliferate, and they ended up with chronic fatigue syndrome. Here's the paper. Leonard Jason came back and said, look, an infectious illness could also cause kindling of the limbic hypothalamic pituitary axis. So there's just another paper that proved that it's not just chemical or electrical. And this is the paper by Ashok Gupta when he was looking, it's very overlapping with limbic kindling model from Leonard Jason. During a traumatic neurological event, often involving acute psychological stress combined with a viral infection or other chemical or physiological stressor, a conditioned network or cell assembly may be created in the amygdala. That's the dendrites, you're getting wired for stress. Proof of this idea, here's a study 2014, neuroinflammation in patients with chronic fatigue. Neuroinflammation is present in a widespread brain areas in CFS patients, was associated with the severity of the neuropsychological symptoms. It's a small study, but there's more than one. Here's another one. Decreased basal ganglia activation in subjects with chronic fatigue syndrome, association with symptoms of fatigue. Reduced basal ganglia function has been associated with fatigue in neurologic disorders as well as patients exposed to chronic immune stimulation. Increased free radical stress in the brain of patients, reduced glutathione oxidative stress may play a role in the psychopathology or pathology. So it's limbic. We're talking about a limbic disorder as part of this picture of what's going on in chronic fatigue syndrome. This is just a little summary to remind us about, limbic disorder is one way to refer to this. This is part of what's happening. It's part of what keeps somebody in a fight, flight, stress response, keeps the mitochondria suppressed and all of those other hormonal and neuroendocrine immune changes. I'm not going to go into that detail of that right now. This is just a summary again, a picture of what's happening specifically with the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, kind of where the rubber hits the road in stress, in the stress model. It's important to note that actually stress and limbic kindling directly impacts lymph flow and the ability to detoxify. This is a paper by Dr. Raymond Perrin, who's an osteopath who works specifically to get lymph flowing again. And he's actually found that when there's a chronic imbalance in the stress response, that actually the sympathetic nervous system does create some rhythmic pumping to keep the lymph flowing. So when that gets disordered, people get a build-up of toxicity, building up around the shoulders, the neck, and so on. And basically, cerebral spinal fluid is getting back up in the brain and isn't flowing properly. So Raymond Perrin is one of the most popular treatments, his treatment in the UK, according to a study of 4,000 CFS patients. So bear that in mind. And when we have this, all of those changes, we're not sleeping properly. And of course, sleep disorders are a major part of CFS. And here was a paper in Science literally showing that sleep is what clears the brain. We have a lymph system in the brain, the glial system in the brain, and if we're not getting sleep, we're not clearing out toxicity. So that's part of the picture as well. I was just focusing on that because they didn't talk about it in the Leonard Jason paper, and yet this is another factor. The other thing that Leonard Jason actually missed out, and I did tell him this, is that he missed out talking about the effect of limbic kindling on the gut. And he said, oh yeah, that's huge. Kind of, he's a professor of psychology, and he was working with a group looking at psychoneuroimmunology, and they just didn't get around to looking at the impact of limbic kindling on the gut. And yet it's massive. These are adults, the effect of stress on in the intestines of human adults. These are the studies. And, the focus on the gut is huge for chronic fatigue. This is a good paper up to 2010. It's a summary of all the papers showing gut inflammation in chronic fatigue syndrome. Going on for that, the 2013 paper, this is Fremont and Demelier, brilliant researcher, top European researcher for US in Europe. Looking at there is gut dysbiosis in CFS and ME. And also it's very interesting, as we know, this is the brilliant Fasano paper, leaky gut causes autoimmunity. Out of interest, there are autoimmune processes going on in chronic fatigue. This is the brilliant rituximab paper where 64% of CFS patients almost practically recovered from an antioth, a drug that's used in kills B lymphocytes and is used for cancer treatment and for autoimmune diseases. So it's very interesting, if you knock out B lymphocytes, that chronic fatigue people actually get significantly better. So that's a very interesting area of research that's ongoing, but it would link with the leaky gut picture as well. And autoimmune is highly linked with emotional trauma. Just the other thing that, Leonard Jason definitely linked limbic kindling to mitochondrial dysfunction, so important. This is the post-exertional fatigue is the cardinal symptom of chronic fatigue syndrome, post-exertional fatigue. And the biological basis of poor stamina and chronic fatigue probably most likely is mitochondrial dysfunction. It won't be the only contributing factor to fatigue. Cortisol levels, sex hormones, the state of the gut also directly lead to fatigue as well. But probably this defining, when somebody has chronic fatigue syndrome, when they have that diagnosis, not adrenal fatigue, but when they have chronic fatigue syndrome, you're looking for the 6 months of at least 6 months of post-exertional fatigue, and they have to have unrefreshing sleep, and as well as part of that this is some of the latest diagnostic criteria. It's why we put so much emphasis on mitochondrial dysfunction. And I'm not going to repeat what Dr. Sarah Myhill's going to cover. Her work is brilliant, worth looking into. It's part of the CFS series for BANT. And, it's how we cycle this. ATP is, the energy currency of the body. When we're slowly recycling that, that's the basis of post-exertional fatigue. But I would also say there's a fantastic evolution and understanding about the role of mitochondria. You don't want to miss the webinar with Ori Whitten, because he really he's actually interviewed the brilliant Dr. Robert Naveau, who's the president of the Mitochondrial Medicine Society, and he's literally looked at the metabolic features of what we're calling the cell danger response. We all think of the mitochondria as just producing ATP. It turns out that's not the only job that mitochondria do. They're also part of the immune defense system, and they're a signaler. They're looking at the body, if you like, and they're looking for signals to say we're under threat. And if we're under threat, what they'll literally do is they'll switch off and change. They'll have what they call a cell danger response. It will change what's going on at the cellular level in order to, as a self-protection mechanism. And I always use the idea of London during the Blitz, where when the bombs were coming in, the population, there were changes. They slept in the tube. There was rationing of food. There was not normal activity going on in London, and that was, and if we thought the enemy was going to get some of our weaponry and our goods, we destroyed that before the enemy could get it. That's exactly what's going on in the cell, and it can be microbial threat, viral, bacterial, fungal, parasites. And essentially, I'm not going to go into detail here because Ari's covering this, I think, but there are 8 fundamental changes to the cell, which basically reduces ATP production, stiffens the cell membrane so you're not getting things in and out of the cell. There's going to be an increased viral defense where you'll literally destroy your own things in the cell that you don't want the enemy to use against you. So, there's an increase in autophagy, mitochondrial fission, mitophagy, and all this to remove the pathogens and so on. So major changes, and I should say, in this original paper, Metabolic Features of Cell Danger Response, physical threats include heat, salt, pH shock, UV ionizing radiation. And here's the key piece, psychological trauma. This is Naveau's paper. This is what he's saying. Psychological trauma, particularly during childhood, can also activate the cell danger response, produce chronic inflammation, and increase the risk of many disorders. So just to say, there it is. It's one of a number. It's very interesting that this cell danger response will change the microbiome, and therefore he also says it's not enough just to balance the bacteria in the gut. He's saying it's not enough. Restoring a sick microbiome is not as simple as adding back missing or underrepresented species. Both the physical habitat of the gut and the nutrient resources delivered, which is controlled by the mitochondria in the cells, must be durably changed in order to produce a durable change in the complex microbial ecosystem, which means you can't correct a gut just by working on the gut alone. You need to address mitochondrial dysfunction, and you need to get the mitochondria back out of the cell danger response. So this is how we have this chronic kind of loop. The limbic kindling and the cell danger response leads to more internal sources of stressors. The amygdala is listening to that. Chemical, electrical, psychological, microbial stress will lead to more limbic kindling and the cell danger response. So that's how somebody gets chronically ill. Here's the very important paper directly studying the mitochondrial cell danger response in CFS patients, and they said it's very clear that there's a cell danger response switched on in CFS patients. So they're calling it being in a state of dower, which is like a flattened state of being, basically it's your cells being in survival. When somebody's in survival because they feel under threat, that your cells are listening. Psychological stress, when you're feeling unsafe as a small child, your body's listening and it's responding at the cellular level. It's affected that level. The brain's listening. Every part of your body is responding to you being in a chronic state of survival mode. When you have a survival brain, you have survival mitochondria. This is a huge expansion in our understanding of stress, and is probably one of the most important papers alongside the ACEs study in medicine today, I think. So major, encourage you to listen to written, as I said. So steps to resolving chronic fatigue syndrome. Number one, we need to clean up the environment, physical, energetic and social. So, all of the stresses, they've got to get rid of those before we switch everything back on again. And we want to reset the body because we know the body's changed in response to emotional trauma. We need to reset the brain and the nervous system because it's stuck in survival. And we need to resolve the emotional developmental trauma at the psychoenergetic emotional level as well. I just want to quickly say it's very interesting. The conventional reductionistic approach of chronic fatigue is like, focus on a virus. The virus is a single cause and just kill that. So interesting that has chronically failed over the years with chronic fatigue syndrome. Epstein-Barr virus, human herpes virus 6, enteroviruses, cytomegaloviruses, all of these viruses and bacteria, chlamydia, chronic Borrelia, brucellosia, they've all been associated with chronic fatigue. But Kenny D'Amelia says, the results of studies are not consistent. Many of these viruses are endemic within human beings with infections occurring early in life. Therefore, a new primary infection of these viruses is unlikely. Most evidence points to a reactivation of these endemic viruses rather than a primary infection. In other words, loads of people have those viruses. Why do some people have an expression of chronic fatigue? Because something weakened their system and allowed those viruses to proliferate. And he says, what are the sort of things that trigger that? Heavy metals, organophosphates, chronic emotional, physical stress. So also he kind of, this XMRV thing, it was a huge deal. It was published in Science, which was unbelievable in the sort of, the world of chronic fatigue syndrome. Unfortunately, it was retracted. Chronic fatigue was headline news for a while. As Court Johnson said, science giveth, and then when it was retracted, science taketh away. So it was a big deal, but this single bug cause has never taken hold. It's the milieu interieur, le microbe n'est rien et le terrain est tout. What does that mean? The microbe is nothing and the terrain is everything. That was supposedly. So what do we need to do? We need to build resilience so that we can fight off bugs. We don't want to kill the bugs. We need to have our own bodies be strong enough to suppress them. And so we start with cleaning up the environment. This is the metabolic cell danger response paper again. And he literally says, not only if you don't clean up the environment, not only will the actual, if you turn on the mitochondria again, you get it out of that state of dower, but the toxins are still in the environment. These conditions, that can cause harm. So he's actually saying that's a harmful thing to do. It's a bit like all the Londoners coming out, they're restoring their normal life, but the bombs are still coming down. You can do harm. So clean up the environment. Chemical cleanup, most people should know how to do this, but there's a summary of the sort of things that I get people to do as soon as they start up. Most people who come to see me have already done the chemical cleanup, but home, organic eating, cleaning up your home hygiene products, water filters, this type of thing. It's all in that link there. Energetic environment. How this is so important. EMF is a stress. Wi-Fi, blue light at night. You need to know all about that and how to get your clients to be cleaning up that as well. And don't forget the client's current social and cultural environment around them is really important as well. Look at all the trauma that comes. It's all relational. So if somebody's got a bad relationship or unsupportive people around them, that will prolong their illness and it can sabotage everything else you're doing. So have a look at, I call them energy vampires, have a look at what people should be looking at to clean that up. It shouldn't be a surprise given attachment trauma to see that, a landmark study, 2004, social support was a stronger predictor of survival than physical activity, body mass index, hypertension, air pollution, alcohol consumption, and even smoking 15 cigarettes a day, a study of over 300,000 people. This is one of the most robust findings of psychoneuroimmunology is that bad relationships, poor close personal relationships, it suppresses your immune function. So, this has been happening with chronic fatigue patients since childhood. You need to check what their current social support is like. Get them away from people who are not supportive, or help them as far as you can. And there may be a limit for what you can do there, but at least you're aware of that impacting your clients. You should be asking about it. Physical reset for the physical body, we know that there's been this impact. We know it's going to affect the entire cascading system in the body. I'm not going to go into details here because this is some of your classical training as a nutrition therapist. So if somebody's had trauma, you are very qualified to deal with it. And it's one of the first things you should do as somebody who's had a lot of early life trauma. You need to know how to assess the difference between insulin resistance and hypoglycemia. You need to know the dietary strategies to be able to fix it. You should know that. Circadian rhythm management is hugely important. You know, all my chronic fatigue patients bed by 9 p.m. They should be in bed by 9 p.m. And bright sunlight, ideally in the first 90 minutes of waking up. Use a lux lamp that emits, you know, a light lamp that emits 10,000 lux to get enough sunshine. They should be getting bright sunshine as much as they can during the day. I shouldn't eat after 6 p.m, this kind of thing. No blue light at night, completely darkened room at night. Makes a huge difference, huge difference to chronic fatigue patients. You're going to be wanting to assess the hormones. You know, you need to know what the symptoms of adrenal stress, adrenal, you know, kind of fatigue is, thyroid imbalances and the sex hormones. I'm currently using the Dutch test for that. You need to know how to assess for the gut. Is there SIBO? Is there dysbiosis? Is there a histamine issue happening? Do they have celiac intolerances? You know, you need to know how to assess and treat the gut. There's so many people out there who do a great job in teaching that I won't go into it. You know, standard assessment for nutrient deficiency is very important. You know, a detox protocol, if somebody's built up toxicity, if they do have fillings and other things, you know, do they need a neurolipid part of that protocol? Do they need to reduce protein for a while, you know, and kind of do some juice fasting, or do they need, you know, higher fats and lipid cell membrane replacement to take out the toxins that have dissolved into the fat membranes? And you know, some of the protocols around that are very important to know about. You want to assess for mitochondrial dysfunction. Useful to know Sarah Myhill's protocol. Ari Whitten's got some brilliant tools to trigger building new mitochondria, like hormesis. You want to know all about hormesis and autophagy and how to rebuild new mitochondria. You may need to still, even if you corrected all that other stuff, you may need to still assess and treat opportunistic infections. There'll be a group that seems to do everything and nothing gets better, and that's the group you might need to go and do some of these testing for some of these Lyme type bugs, and that's a whole area in itself. Certainly, you know, if you end up with that group, you might want to refer to a Lyme specialist or learn how to do that, perhaps testing through Regenerist Labs for their viral and Lyme protocols. And, you know, be aware that a lot of people with chronic fatigue syndrome have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, utterly underdiagnosed at the moment, hyper joint mobility. Look up Cusack protocol and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, as there's been a breakthrough in that area. Look for the symptoms of it and make sure you check into that as well. HPU is the pyroluria, so stress causes the loss of magnesium B6 and manganese, so you're switching off the immune system. You know, you get more and more detailed. You should start at the top, work down, and, you know, if somebody's not getting better after you're doing all this, and you're doing the other things I'm going to cover here, you know, if they still aren't getting through some of these things at the bottom here, the last two items are sometimes things you end up needing to look at. But you first, before you get into looking at those, you know, I would also be looking into, you need to rewire the brain. Your client needs to be getting out of survival in their brain. They need to be feeling in a safe space. And this is as important as any dietary change you could recommend. These are like what I call them daily reset rituals. You know, the big ones are meditation, Tai Chi, yoga, Qigong. They're so important because there's the most research behind them. They're cheap. You can do them at home. Breath work, you know, left nostril breathing. There's major science journals are actually showing how neurons are watching how somebody breathes. And if you're breathing too shallowly, you go into the survival stress response. Think what's happening when somebody's in an emotional stress response all the time. They're changing the brain, they're changing the gut, and they're changing the cell response. And if you're dumping in tons of nutrients to try and rebuild mitochondrial function and the person is wired for stress, it's not going to work. It's not going to work as effectively. So these are must items. 20 minutes a day, doing it twice a day. They need to learn, maybe it's the you know, the relaxation response. They need to learn how to do that. They need to learn how to meditate. Perhaps yoga and breathing is, for people who can't meditate, yoga and breath work is going to be the way forward. Breath work's often for the people who can't do meditation. And you should know, you should have tools and recommendations for your clients, and these are requirements for people overcoming fatigue. They need to know, also they need to have fun again and learn. These people's bodies are in a state of survival. So just doing fun things is sending a message to the amygdala that everything's okay now. And you start changing the neural pathways through doing that. So the exercise is a huge part, pacing. You know, if you get the wrong type of exercise in, you cause chronic somebody's illness. Somebody's in a high stress state, still in a high cortisol stage of fatigue. No cardio, no cardio. You should be doing, you know, gentle stuff only, perhaps weight training, you know, gentle yoga, yin yoga, not yang yoga. If they're in the wired but tired stage, you know, here's a tip here, the book, The Adrenal Reset Diet by my colleague, Dr. Alan Christensen. A great book for looking at what type of exercise someone should do depending on stage they're at. You know, severe cases, you should be doing a little bit of pacing. If somebody is constantly in boom and bust, so they're collapsing, and then as soon as they get energy, they're doing things again, that will prevent recovery from chronic fatigue. It will sabotage everything else you're doing. The maladaptive stress response, this is being traumatized by the illness. And what's often forgotten is that getting a chronic illness and your life collapsing around you, if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, your relationships collapse, you can lose your job, your marriage can fail. That's a trauma in itself. So these are the symptoms that we look for what we call the maladaptive stress response. This is possibly if somebody can't reset the neural pathways with things like meditation, all the rest of it, and you can see they're still in a stress state. You've calmed the gut down, or actually they can't tolerate what you're recommending because they're still in the chronic stress state. That's potentially a referral if you're a nutritionist. By the way, this is the brilliant work of Patricia Fennell looking at the role of how chronic disease is a trauma in itself. I really recommend looking into her work, but I've got to wrap this up. So these are the kind of referrals for that someone in a maladaptive stress response who's become traumatized by being ill. And, you know, everything else won't work if you don't fix this. It's very interesting that the lightning process recently had a huge study, a pretty large study published with children showing lightning process worked for them, and it was published in a mainstream journal. So this, you know, amygdala retraining it was published originally in the Hypothesis Journal, 90-day program at the Optimum Health Clinic. The original paper was published in the British Medical Journal Open, preliminary study on that. This is all neurolinguistic programming techniques, dynamic neural retraining, Annie Hoppers in North America. So those are very good proven interventions, but psychotherapy, counselling, cognitive behavioural therapy is still the official recommended NICE guideline for chronic fatigue. So you might need to be looking into those as a referral. But what should we be doing at the emotional level? You know, it's interesting that originally the ACEs study, the original ACEs study, started in an obesity clinic in San Diego, and people couldn't work out why they were having a huge dropout rate in this obesity clinic. And it was Dr. Felitti, who's one of the original ACEs people, and he could not figure out why patients were getting more anxious as they were losing weight, and then 55% dropping out. So they surveyed the group and found out by accident that they were reporting a high rate of abuse in childhood. Now this was an obesity clinic, 100 pounds plus overweight. And he basically said, one woman summed it up and she said, being fat was a protection mechanism. It protected against unwanted attention. So here we have, in her mind, being healthy and thin is a threat to her survival. Just think about that. How is that going to sabotage any other protocol recommendations that you could make? Now, when we have early life trauma, we have an epidemic of self-love deficit disorder, and it leads to addictions. Addictions are massive with people with ACEs. If you have 4 ACEs, you're 11 times more likely to use injection drugs, 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 3 times more likely to engage in risky sexual behaviour and binge drinking and things like this. But it's more the subtle forms of addiction as well, like perfectionism. It's like, if I don't feel inherently loved, I have to be perfect, and then I deserve love. Or people pleasing, I have to please others and I have to do what others want me to do. That's how I'll get love, because I don't feel it inherently. People will eat their emotions, like food. They'll use food to feel better. People will over-exercise, will overwork. Anxious productivity. It's all proving their self-worth, because underlying that is self-love deficit disorder. And this is where you're seeing chronic fatigue people sabotaging 2 things. They won't be pacing properly, and they won't be able to do some of these relaxation things, because it actually is triggering for them. It triggers feelings underneath that of abandonment, of not being good enough, and it will trigger shame. Them stopping and relaxing can trigger shame. So now one of the things is to do this, to get with the lightning process and kind of these NLP processes. That's for, the maladaptive stress response is very mental. So it's when somebody's constantly chronically thinking, overthinking in their mind. So sometimes you need to do NLP first. You have to do that first just for people to start connecting into the deeper stuff, because this is emotional and it's usually shadow work. It means it's unconscious and they're disassociated from their underlying feelings. They're just acting out the feelings. So they've got these behaviours and they know they're kind of in a frustrated state because they can't comply, and it's just their behaviour just seems to be out of control. That's underlying emotional trauma. So quite often someone might need to do the NLP piece first, but if they're still not better and they're still sabotaging at the pacing level, they're not pacing properly, they're not able to get into a relaxation response, this is what to look at. So any activity can be used to distract and disassociate from painful feelings, which creates negative health consequences. And we know at the Optimum Health Clinic, we looked at achievers, helpers, perfectionists and anxiety types. This is the Enneagram system of 9 personality types, where it actually looks at why people do what they do, not just their behaviour. And we found it all correlated with the science data. So, chronic fatigue people they're called action proneness, or their anxiety proneness. And this is where, what do achievers really think? At their core, they have self-worth issues, so they have to get status and do lots of action to be okay. They don't take enough rest, and unfortunately, they can end up with CFS. Helper types, lots of practitioners, lots of mums are this type. They just discount their own needs, give themselves away, constantly focusing on everybody else, don't do enough self-care, and at the core it's a lovability issue. I must help others to be okay. A perfectionist type, I'm bad or wrong if I don't do things perfectly, creates huge stress. Anxiety types at the core, they feel unsupported. I must do whatever is expected of me to be okay, very unsafe all the time, and that's just triggering survival constantly. And just as a final note here, ACEs create unconscious belief systems. Like, you have the placebo effect, you also have nocebo. If you don't think you're going to get better, you won't. And if you don't think you deserve health, then you're likely going to manifest that, and it will sabotage everything else that you do. So what can we do here? Well, you can start with getting to look at the ACEs questionnaire. That's important. It's a start point. I've listed it on my website. You can just go online and put ACEs questionnaire, and it's the original questions they exactly asked from the ACEs study. You can educate your patients about that. Give them a blog article about ACEs, so they don't get sort of, why is she asking me personal questions? If you're worried about that, educate, have it on your website, do a podcast, have it, do an interview, do a summit on it. So education, pre-education can be important. Make sure they know why, if needed, and then include it in your intake questionnaires. And as a nutritional therapist, I think you should do this. I used the questionnaire that Dr. Jonice Webb, the author of Running on Empty, she's the expert right now in emotional neglect. I also include her questionnaire, which is digging deeper, because, as I say, the ACEs score is pretty superficial. I have an extended ACE questionnaire you can look at, by the way, where I've added things that people missed. Obviously the ACEs study is scientifically validated. There's also something called the Close Relationship Questionnaire. It's scientifically validated. That is assessing attachment in adulthood, and it can link back to ideas of how well they're attached as children. Starts to give you an idea about psychological state and how they are in adulthood as well. It's scientifically validated. I would do an Enneagram assessment of everybody that comes into my clinic, and you can do it right there. And also I often use the 12 steps for a laundry list of codependent symptoms, which is it's a 12-step program for adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. There's a lot of clinical experience with this, even though you won't see as much PubMed data, but it's very, inner child work, shadow work, and 12-step programs, especially for children of narcissistic parents, dysfunctional families, alcoholics. There's a lot of clinical research and work on that. So you can use their assessment list and start to look at, bringing this up with your clients. So how do we clear that work? Well, first of all, quite often with shadow work, people are disconnected from these deeper feelings. They're just acting out unconsciously. How do you come in touch with feelings again and become aware of them? Yoga will do that because it's body work. Conscious breathing actually brings awareness back into the body, and what we call sensate focusing or emotional mindfulness. Pure meditation that's just mindfulness where you're stopping and disassociating thoughts doesn't work for shadow work, not recommended for that. The 4 items below that will actually are emotional release work where there's no talking involved. You don't even need to be conscious of that you have certain things. These therapies will directly connect you to the feeling. You can have a release immediately in the therapy. If you suddenly feel like crying or have an emotional release. So somatic experiencing by the work by Dr. Peter Levine is awesome. Cranial sacral therapy can do this. The Rosen method and network spinal analysis, and you can look them up. And then the last screen here is like discrete versus complex trauma. Discrete incidents, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that's EMDR, that's a scientifically validated mainstream psychology intervention. Emotional freedom technique is great for discrete incidents, increasing evidence, over 500,000 people listen to the summit online for the EFT. Thought field therapy is very similar. I've listed a few others here. Trauma incidence reduction therapy, Havening technique, and brainwork recursive therapy are popular, but you won't see science evidence behind them yet. I've put them there because your clients might ask you about them, and you might want to just try them and find out about them. But they are, EFT at one time had no data behind it either, and yet now it's becoming mainstream. So probably these other ones may do as well. But just so you know, there isn't science. Hypnotherapy can work for some people, doesn't work for others. We have, psychological individuality just like we have biological individuality. For complex trauma, which is the developmental and developmental and attachment trauma, you still want to do all these discrete therapies for the discrete memories that you may have, but it's more complex. The top one at the moment, neurofeedback, is what Dr. Leonard Jason and it's Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's favourite therapy. It's expensive. There is kind of scant research on it. They're trying to raise research for it, but you're talking probably £100 twice a week for, you need 20 sessions, can be quite expensive. Inner child work's really important. You're looking at John Bradshaw's work. That's also part of the 12-step program. It's more complex. You need to do a range of different things when it's complex trauma, like cognitive understanding, reading the books around inner child work. You can actually see an attachment therapist, somebody who specialises in it. There's also group therapy, that's the Hoffman process. So these are the types of things and where they're appropriate for different people. So there's also family constellations therapy, not science-backed, but a lot of clinicians. Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt uses this therapy. It can be very powerful for intergenerationally inherited trauma. So as a final point, what as practitioners can you do? You don't have to train in multiple different modalities. It's your awareness that counts. It's that assessment. It's knowing when you're looking at somebody and saying, this person has got huge trauma, they're still in survival mode, and what I'm doing on the physical side is not going to work so well unless they deal with that, and I need to know how. I need a network of practitioners I can refer to. Rule of thumb, if we want to change our patients, we need to change ourselves first. I recommend you look at your own ACEs and you look at your own experience. Do these questionnaires for yourself. Get connected to your own trauma. Try out different therapies for yourself, because that's how you learn to going and talking about and becoming aware of what people need to do. Become a healer. Don't just be a practitioner, but actually become a healer, which means that, remember, based on the research of heart math, being in the presence of a coherent, clear heart and brain field, you can heal your patients with your presence before you've even prescribed a single supplement or given a single treatment. And that's the stage that I get to with my clients now, where I can see intuitively how somebody's feeling, what they're thinking, what's going on in them emotionally as well as physically. And I can have people starting to talk to me about things they've never talked before, because I'm creating a very safe space for them, and they're having releases and they're feeling so much better even before I've recommended any dietary changes or anything. So, that's becoming more of a healer, a kind of somatic, empathic healer. And I think we can all do that, and we need it, because love heals and empathy heals. Love is medicine. So the more that you're bringing a compassionate presence to your clients, the more healing that is. But you first need to learn to have that compassionate compliance for yourself. Okay? So really that's the takeaway. Physician, heal thyself first. Please email me if you have any questions about anything. On my website, I do have a free ebook on the 7 steps to rebuilding emotional resilience again. And there's a lot of links to website links. So there's a resource in there about more details about all those referrals and sort of the different types of therapies out there. So thank you very much. Take care and do email me and stay in touch if you have any questions. Bye for now.